Moment. Okay. All right. So this is a philosophical dialogue between myself, Rick Rapetti, professor of philosophy at CUNY, Kingsborough Community College, and this is Edin. It's been so many years since I had to pronounce your name in class. I don't remember how to say your last name. Why don't you tell us?
Čekić.
Čekić, that's what I thought. I probably said it wrong in school. I don't. You may have never corrected me. Um, so yeah, I told you where I work. Edin is a high school teacher in Brooklyn, science teacher. Yeah.
Yes.
Like to say anything else about yourself before we get started on our topic?
Sure. So I've been teaching earth science for about 5 years or so.
Earth science, right?
Yes, correct. And I also have taught chess in schools as well.
Chess.
And
Oh
I
boy.
am an avid chess player.
Oh, that's great. That's a sign of intelligence. The logic and the memory and the strategy and all of that goes into it. Good for you. So, yeah, so this is just a sort of informal philosophical dialogue that I don't think I mentioned. Well, I implied it that Edin was a student of mine years ago when I mentioned my taking attendance and pronouncing his name at Kingsborough Community College in my philosophy class. So I'm always proud when one of my former students goes on to become an educator. So we've got Edin. Edin and I, just informally for the audience, Edin and I have been having these kinds of conversations just for fun. And they've gotten so rich and interesting that I thought, you know what, we should record them. And I occasionally do podcasts um, that are planned and much more edited with fancy media equipment and everything, but these are conversations that we just have in Zoom. And so I decided, you know what, I'm going to start recording these, and this is the first one. So I just thought I would mention that as a kind of preface to how we got here and kind of why we're here today. And we shot back and forth a few topics about what we might want to talk about. I believe I suggested this one, doubt. I don't remember what the other subjects were, but I'll say a little bit why I suggested doubt as a topic, and then we'll just dive in. I um, I do engage in philosophical discussions on Twitter with a bunch of people who, well, one of my friends who's also a co-host of the podcast that I work on with him called Level to Power. His name is Mark Gleason. And the podcast there is, by the way, www.leveltopower, leveltopower.com. For anybody who wants to go see some of those podcasts, those are longer than what we're going to do today. We just have about an hour. Um, yeah, on those shows, we do them in a studio and whatnot, and they're much more elaborate, but these are simpler. So in any event, that's my co-host. He's the one who got me to, he kind of dragged me into Twitter to help him out in some debates with some people that he was arguing with online. And that's how I started doing Twitter. I mean, I think I had an account that just never used it. Um, but there's a bunch of people on that feed in this thread who are followers of a famous actor named Mark Pellegrino, who was one of the leading characters in a TV series called Supernatural, and a bunch of other shows. And this fellow, Mark Pellegrino, he was on Lost, he was on Dexter, he's on all sorts of television shows. He happens to be a kind of what I would call an amateur philosopher, an amateur. I don't use that word in a negative sense. I use it in the literal meaning of it, which means a lover of something. Amare is to love in Italian and Latin and there. So someone who loves something, who does it out of love, not as a profession or an avocation. But like he's taken courses in philosophy. I think even now, even though he's successful in life as an actor, he's in the middle of a long philosophy program somewhere. So it's kind of like all of his fans this particular Twitter feed that he posts philosophical ideas, and these debates get going, and so I got dragged into a number of them. But in a very recent one, a number of his, let's say, philosophical compadres, they are what you might call objectivists. It's a kind of epistemology where you believe in concrete scientific evidence and reality, and you're not too friendly towards relativism or skepticism or any of that other stuff. So it came up, and they were all being really strong about, they made some remarks that seemed dismissive of any positive role for doubt whatsoever. I think that's because they're very averse to skepticism, because skepticism is used by a lot of people to kind of undermine our confidence or faith in anything, right? And then that becomes a kind of political weapon. But I have a positive attitude toward doubt. So I started debating with them, and the debate just went on and on and on. And they're kind of ideologically very strong-minded, these people. So that subject was on my mind, and it was fresh when Edin and I were saying, well, we could talk about this, we could talk about that. And that was one of the ones I mentioned, but I think you picked it, right, Edin, out of a list of topics that I gave you?
Yes.
I believe you did. Okay, so okay, that was my background for bringing doubt as a possible topic. Do you have a reason why you might have picked it, or just curiosity, or?
Oh, yes, certainly. I mean, I have remembered this topic, or remembered this word, I would say, that when I've noticed a topic that you've proposed, reminded me very clearly of Bram Stoker, Dracula, pretty much, and a quote that he had said one time, and it goes with quote, "We learn from failure, not from success," unquote. So I think that when you speak of doubt, that seems to be something that is naturally innate to us of the human species. And in this current day and age that we live in, it seems to be more of a taboo to do that what is natural, and that is to doubt. Because if you doubt, then you are seen as not the objective person. But in the sense, objectivity starts with doubt, and then you work your way to posing a question which will then allow you to research what it is that you're trying to find. So I would say that's what brought about the reason why I wanted to focus on doubt.
Right. I like the way you put that doubt is a kind of initial, I'm adding to what you said now, but this is what I was hearing and interpreting as you were speaking. And I know that you're a scientist, or at least a science teacher, that it's necessary for objectivity. In other words, we operate normally with models of reality, whatever they are, whether it's physical reality, political reality, economic reality, social reality, whatever kind of medical reality, whatever the things that we are that we think are true, objectively real, or that exist. We have all these models, views about what's true and real. And doubt is we'll say a lot more about this in the hour, but it's some kind of indication or sense or radar or antenna for the possibility that there's something wrong with one of our models. And then if we ignore our doubts, we won't investigate, and we won't find out what might be wrong with the model. But you're also right that there's a tremendous social or societal, or I should say just group pressure from anybody who accepts a model that you doubt. So groupthink always involves some model that these are the appropriate things to think about X, whatever the topic is. And so if you doubt it, immediately everybody in the group is going to feel somehow or another threatened by you questioning, is that true? Or are you sure about that? You know, this kind of thing. Or I'm not so sure about that, right? So it's healthy. It's important. The scientific method, right? Where would this go in the scientific method? It's kind of in the hypothesis forming place, maybe, where you see the theory that's been accepted, and you think maybe there's another hypothesis about this phenomenon that's better, or that maybe this hypothesis that's been so far confirmed or accepted or whatever might not be actually accurate. Maybe there's another variable, or maybe there's something else that we haven't looked at, or something. Maybe there's some correlation, causation error, or whatever it is, right? So I could see where it would fit in somehow or another in the scientific method, and you're a scientist, so that's good. Okay, so that, yeah, so I guess it makes perfect sense that somebody who teaches science would want to explore and have a greater exposition and articulation and examination, analysis, etc., about doubt. Great. So I guess that would at least initially answer one of my questions, which is why should we examine doubt? I think between the two of us, we already answered that question. So, and we might have already given some, I mean, everybody has common sense understanding. I mean, if you recall one of your philosophy classes with me, because I think I did this in almost all of my classes, we must have examined, I mean, I could be wrong, but I think we probably examined Socrates' inquiry into the nature of piety. What is piety? What makes something pious or holy or good, right? And like his friend, the religious friend, Euthyphro, said, oh, whatever the gods say is holy, is what makes something holy, or something like that. And Socrates is like, well, you know, maybe you got that backwards, you know, that kind of thing, right? So, but like, whenever I teach that, I'm like, I'll tell my students, well, like we all have a conception offhand of what it means for someone to be pious or a devout member of a religion, right? We know what the word means. Similarly, we know what the word doubt means. But coming up with a philosophical definition of piety or justice or doubt or any kind of key concept that kind of defines our mental landscape is not the same thing as our ordinary dictionary understanding of a term, right? So what are we doing here? We can't just go and look in the dictionary and say, oh, this is what doubt is. It says this in the dictionary. Also, because sometimes dictionaries can be misleading. You know, they usually count as some evidence of what most people who speak a language mean when they say X, right? But that's not enough for philosophers. We want a deeper conceptual understanding. We might not be able to completely define something in a perfect definition which captures everything that is doubt and excludes everything that is not doubt, right? And what we would call that would be necessary and sufficient conditions for doubt, right? If it lacks something, if it lacks X, then it's not doubt. That would be a necessary condition for doubt. And if it even just has Y, then it's doubt. That would be a sufficient condition for doubt. If you can give the necessary and the sufficient conditions, you've given a completely perfect definition, right? But sometimes you can't do that. And the only way you could define things is by pointing at them, whatever. So there's a variety of different ways of defining things. But that's what let's spend a little time just trying to talk about what doubt is, right? Like we may or may not get necessary or sufficient conditions, but it might be just good enough to get examples or intuitions, whatever. So you want to start that, or?
Yeah, sure. I'd be
Yeah,
more than happy to.
good. What does doubt mean to you, Edin?
Sure. So when I'm looking at doubt, I find it often difficult to separate doubt from being skeptical or skepticism. It's almost as they are two interchangeable words, and you have a choice of which one you'd like to use when you are engaging in a conversation. And, you know, obviously 21st century science has its skeptical premises. But, if we want to go back to the ancient world, we have to remember, Phaeron of Elis, who was basically the father of skepticism, and he was the one who apparently had this notion that questioning things was inherently innate to us humans, because this is one of the ways that we can learn. So when I'm approaching this from a scientific point of view, it is something that is almost naturally part of science. Often it is presented today in the 21st century that maybe if you are a skeptic, you are not necessarily in tune with what the scientific community has to say. But this is not necessarily true, because the scientific community does not operate under consensus. Because if the scientific community operated under consensus, then how would it be different from any religion or any religious ideology? So if there is somebody that comes up with new research, for example, and says, well, my research has shown that this or that topic is not necessarily yielding the evidence that we're looking for, then that is part of science. That is part of the research that has been done. That is part of the answer. But in today's world, it is seen that if you question a scientist with a PhD, and this is something that I noticed I would probably say with the younger generation, if you ask questions or if you pose skepticism towards their research, you are automatically branded as somebody who is in doubt of science.
Oh, right. You're a science denier.
Correct.
Yeah.
And in this case, it almost seems like an oxymoron. Well, how is it that you are in the science field and you're not allowed to pose questions,
Right.
or you're not allowed to be skeptical towards another scientist who has done research?
Yeah, I mean, the history of science is, in a way, and you hear this from critics of science, but I'm not saying it as a criticism, I'm saying it as a virtue. The history of science can be described as a history of endless falsification of previous theories, but they're not just rejected, they are improved upon by greater evidence, greater research, and greater analysis, greater logical manipulation of the data, more careful interrogation of the same data through new methodologies and whatnot. So it's not like Newtonian physics was falsified by Einstein, right? He's just adding to it. And he's showing that it has a limited scope and that there are other aspects of physical reality where other equations need to be employed, that those equations work at a certain level, but they are limited. They don't work in every case, right? So it's not like we threw out. I mean, sometimes in the history of science, some theories that were previously accepted are rejected flat out, like phlogiston, which is, I don't know if you remember this word. This was something like some kind of element that earlier scientists thought accounted for fire, before we really understood fire. And I mean, even the earliest theories going back to the Greeks, they had the scientific method in a crude form where they had observations and theories about them. So they thought everything was made out of, one of them thought everything was made out of water, which seems absurd. Thales, 700 BCE in Greece, thought everything is made out of water. And okay, that might seem silly, but compare that with the prior supernatural theories, which were proto-scientific also. So like you'd have the religionists in his day who saw lightning and thunder and associated that with anger and violence. And then when we and animals that we know are angry and violent, we make loud noises and disrupt things, and there's banging and whatnot. And so they thought, they made an analogy and projected the idea that the sky was angry when there was lightning and thunder. So they thought the sky was a conscious being, right? But they gave a kind of supernatural explanation for natural phenomena, which just turned out to be wrong, right? And that supernatural explanation got reified and eventually became a personified entity, Zeus or something like that, or Thor, depending on, well, lots of different cultures had the same ideas. So there was something natural about human minds trying to understand and explain phenomena. They come up with a hypothesis, it seems to work, and they accept it. But then Thales comes along, and now he's almost doing the same thing, but he's trying to explain natural phenomena, not in a supernatural hypothesis, but with a natural hypothesis. Everything's made out of water because look, water can come in 3 different forms. You wouldn't, this was a discovery for human beings at some point, that when snow and ice melts, it's water. And when it burns, it turns into steam. It can be solid, liquid, and gas. So this magical element can be in 3 different modes of matter. Maybe everything else is a form of water, right? Condensed in some way. And then another guy, Heraclitus, said, no, everything is fire. And they didn't have a word for energy, but if you just substitute the word energy for fire, his theory comes pretty close to reality, where he thought everything is a form of fire. And then things that don't seem like they're fire are burning very slowly, right? So if you think about atoms and energy and everything, you could see, well, what is heat? It's mean molecular kinetic energy, right? So they were onto, and the atomists thought, oh no, it's tiny things we don't even see that explain. So they one theory after another, and now we just have better theories and we have better testing methods, right? But every single time we had a model and suspected it might be wrong, that was doubt. Call it what you want. Call it skepticism, call it uncertainty, call it doubt. It's a sense that this model might not be right. I have some reason for thinking it might not. Even if you can't articulate it, you can have a doubt about it. It just doesn't strike you as right, right? So there's like layers and degrees of doubt, right? And that's something else that we could talk about after we finish saying what doubt is. But yeah, I would try to say something like doubt is some kind of an awareness that a belief previously held to be true, or that others hold to be true, might be false. Right? Now, you could have a whole bunch of beliefs and say, well, any of them might be false, right? But it's an active thinking that a particular belief or worldview actually is, or there's reason to think that this one actually is false, even if you can't say, here's the evidence, right? Sometimes it's just a sense that you have, right? So I don't know, how does that sound to you about what doubt is?
I think that you touched up on many important ways of reasoning in the ancient world. And most of them were based on, again, the natural ability of the human species to want to understand something.
Exactly.
And I think that this comes from simply being honest with yourself, from having some sort of integrity, from wanting to know, from wanting to learn, from wanting to understand. This makes me think of Thomas Huxley, because Thomas Huxley said something very similar to what Charles Darwin said, but in a slightly different way, when he was talking about the scientific man, and Thomas Huxley said, quote, the man of science has learned to believe in justification, and not by faith, but by verification,
Right.
unquote. So if you are approaching a question and you are looking for justification, and you are not merely looking for hope or faith to believe in a specific reality, then you are being sincere in your search. Now, I know that this is going to probably sound maybe distasteful to people of faith, people of religions who believe that faith is a powerful driving force and it is immune to doubt. But doubt stems from wanting to learn the reasoning or the truth or an explanation to a question that you may have.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned justification and explanation because they're related in an important way epistemologically. Well, for the audience, I've used the word epistemology once or twice. We should just say not everybody knows what that means. It means the theory of knowledge or the study of the nature of knowledge. What are the criteria of knowledge, that sort of thing? What makes something count as knowledge? As opposed to all the different actual kinds of knowledge we have in various different fields. This is more like a meta level thing. What makes any knowledge knowledge? That's epistemology, that level of inquiry. And science is a very high form of epistemology because it has justification by way of evidence, observation, and then logical analysis or reasoning and testing, testing of the hypotheses. So that there's a whole bunch of scientific criteria that are kind of meta level principles like Occam's razor, which says always favor the simpler explanation and so on, right? So, but justification and explanation are not the same. And, well, in science, they are almost the same. They're interdependent. You can't have a good explanation without justification for it. Otherwise, it's just a speculative, like metaphysics, just a kind of speculative theory floating around in the air of concepts without having its feet on the ground, right? Science always has its feet on the ground. I mean, you could have scientific hypotheses that are not tested at all, or that can't be tested, right? Or that as of now, we don't really know how to test them. Like I've heard that, and I don't know enough about it. I'm not competent enough to say I know this to be true, but I've heard intelligent physicists say that string theory is something that has great explanatory power, but almost no evidence for it. So there's that difference between justification and explanation. But the other difference I wanted to make, because you said religion or faith, is that like almost any religious system of belief is a kind of coherentist model. And by coherentist, we mean something like every claim in the system is coherent, in theory, at least in principle. If you want to put the best possible light on a religious belief system, you say they at least they have this coherentist element. So a coherentist system in epistemology is one in which every single claim is supportive of the others in some way. So almost every religion has ways in which all the different components and values and stories and narrative, they all kind of fit together to form a model, right? So they can have a kind of explanatory model, like a certain kind, like let's say in Hinduism or in Buddhism, there's a belief in karma and reincarnation. Those are very well fit for each other. So if the law of karma, which says everything you do kind of comes back to you, that's a simplified version of it, but every action has a consequence and everything is explained, like everything happens for a reason, but not in the sense that, God makes everything happen, but that everything that happens is explained by an action performed by somebody else, and that's, interconnected with everything else, almost like Newtonian physics, but it's a kind of psycho-spiritual version of it, right? That everything you do comes back to you in some way, shape, or form. Also, reincarnation. When we die, our mental essence somehow or another survives the death of the body and winds up reincarnating in another body. Well, you put those two beliefs together and they could explain to somebody who wants to know, why do horrible things happen to good people, right? So that's a legitimate question. Almost every human being says, why is the world so bad? Or why do bad things happen to good people? If karma and reincarnation were true, right, those would explain that, oh, well, that innocent baby who just died in a fire, maybe they were an evil person in their last life and they burnt some other baby to death or something, right? So like, it has explanatory power. It has all this coherent, all the pieces in the model fit well together. If they were true, they would and could explain all sorts of things. But the question is there any evidence for thinking that they're true? And that's justification. But many people in the religious mode of thinking, as opposed to the scientific mode, place such a great emphasis or value on explanatory power and very little on justification, on evidence. Right? So that's the difference between, one of the major differences between science and religion is that science won't accept one of these explanatory models unless it's the best one that's justified by all of our evidence, right? So that's the difference. But and then because the model in religion is so psychologically explanatory, it helps people who believe it to walk their way through life with all that clarity in their mind. It's a kind of psychological safety net, right? And then if you doubt one of those beliefs of theirs, right, you say, well, the Bible says that, according to the biblical experts, the world is only 5,700 and some odd years old. But I mean, it's clearly the case that civilizations are a lot older than that. We've got cave paintings that are 30,000 years old. We've got, dinosaurs that are there are hominid ancestors that are millions of years old, and so on and so on and so on. So the believer in whatever it is, not just religion, but in any ideology, if you doubt any component of it, the whole thing is in jeopardy. And that's why I think you said many people have a kind of averse reaction to doubt, because doubt threatens to pull the rug out from underneath people's world orientation maps, as you might want to call belief systems. Now, I've gone on and on for a while. So let me hear what you have to say about what I just said. Or
Yes, I can certainly resonate with you, especially with the last point, the pulling of the rug underneath them. And it's very fascinating to note that these similar questions have been addressed prior to our time. We don't even have to go to the ancient world. We can go to the earlier 20th century. I'm sure you're familiar with Friedrich Nietzsche, for example.
Anybody who's not is missing out on a good part of human culture and history and thought.
Yeah, Friedrich Nietzsche, wrote some books, but he is definitely very well known for challenging this notion of religious belief and how it manifests into the reality of society. But the pulling of the rug is something that stood out to me, as you just lastly mentioned, because that reminded me of one of Nietzsche's quotes, very famous quotes, which reads, quote, it says, "Sometimes people don't want to hear the truth because they don't want their illusions to be destroyed," unquote. So
Yeah.
it really, at the end of the day, depends what it is that you are seeking. If you, are of the mindset that you have belief in phenomena or concepts that are not verified or explained by science, then you obviously are not going to be doubtful about that, because you have already made a choice, and the choice is not to doubt. And this is a very important distinction to make between someone who relies on testable evidence and somebody who does not rely on testable evidence and believes that testable evidence does not supersede the metaphysical world.
Yeah. Yeah, good point. So let me ask you a question. You started out by saying earlier on in our conversation that the words skeptical or skeptic or skepticism and doubt, they can be almost synonymous. They can be, but there can also be differences. This is a matter of semantics, but I don't mean that in the sense of, oh, well, when we say, oh, it's just semantics insofar as they all mean the same thing. Don't act like there's a difference when there's not. There can be important differences, and maybe a better way of talking about it is that there are different kinds of doubt or different kinds of skepticism. So one of the distinctions that philosophers make that I'm sure you're familiar with, regardless of what it might be called, is, well, I'll just call it a distinction between kind of global skepticism and a local skepticism. So it'd be easier to give an example of local skepticism when you say, well, I believe in astronomy, but I'm skeptical about astrology, right? That's local. That means I don't doubt all of science. I only doubt like pseudoscience or something like. I'm skeptical about, there might be something to it. I've met a lot of people who I thought were Aquarians, and, they turned out to be Aquarians. And you hear this all the time from people who believe in astrology. Really, sometimes even really smart people, people who are otherwise seem quite intelligent, think that there really is something to it. So you might say, well, I don't believe in astrology, but this is kind of the opposite of doubt. Like, maybe there's something to it, right? I don't know what it is, but maybe there's something to. So that's almost like the opposite of doubt. Like, doubt is willingness to entertain the possibility that a belief or a belief system is false. We need a word that's a kind of opposite of doubt, which is the same willingness to believe that a proposition, a statement or claim or a set of claims or beliefs could be true, right? It's something like there's a spectrum somehow or another between belief and doubt, right? So I doubt that, but, similarly, I kind of anti-doubt if I think, well, maybe there's something to astrology. All right. So there's all these different categories of things that it's hard to sort them out. It would be nice if we could make a really nice map, a concept map, with like a flow chart or something that categorized all the different kinds of doubt and belief. I don't think we're going to do anything like that today, but just the difference between local, getting back to my first distinction, local skepticism, right? Like I might doubt that, moral veganism is correct, right? The vegans are out there saying don't eat animals, etc. I might think, well, there might be something to it, but I don't believe it, whatever. So that's local skepticism. Whereas I don't doubt many other. I suppose I accept everything in science, except I have my doubts about the new science that's coming out in like the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, the DSM. It's put out by the American Psychological Association, and they make certain kinds of claims that seem ideologically driven, that don't have much to do with the biology of sex, let's just say, right? They made remarks in the last one about, what was that called? Toxic masculinity, right? That I thought were exaggerated. I didn't think they were based on science. So I would say I'm basically a science believer, not a science denier, but there are some areas of science that I have my doubt. I'm skeptical about them. So that's local skepticism. Global skepticism, on the other hand, is what epistemologists would describe as believing that knowledge itself is impossible in any category whatsoever, right? Those are global skeptics, like Pyrrho, the Greek, the ancient Greek philosopher, he was a global skeptic, you might want to say. And there were a few other ancient philosophers who were global skeptics. I wouldn't say so in between local skepticism and global skepticism, I don't think science is anywhere near global skepticism. I think it's much more on the local skepticism side. It believes that claims can be justified enough to be considered knowledge in certain domains, even though they're revisable in principle based on future evidence. Does that sound right? Some people are worried about global skepticism. So those people that I mentioned at the very beginning, who I'm debating with on Twitter, they're very kind of allergic to global skeptics. Because they're objectivists, like they believe in knowledge and reality. So who's going to critique them? The global skeptics, who are going to say there's no such thing as objective truth. There's no such thing as reality. It's all subjective. It's all relative. It's all language. It's all human constructs and all this kind of stuff. So what do you think about the difference between global skepticism, knowledge, local skepticism, science? Where does that fit in? Even though science is endlessly revisable? I'm just curious. Some thoughts of yours on that.
Sure. So
that's a lot, but
it certainly is a lot. I'd probably focus on the local skepticism, especially from the science perspective. This is again something that is naturally part of the root of science, because without being locally skeptical, then you're not going to be able to refine your experiment. Part of being skeptical is to repeat your experiment at least 3 times.
Right.
Maybe even more than that, depending on what it is that you're actually looking for.
Absolutely.
And if you are an even more rigorous scientist, then you may even repeat your experiment many more times and even ask others to repeat a very similar experiment.
Yeah, absolutely. That's the repeatability criterion.
Correct.
In the social sciences, in the last decade or so, we've encountered what's called, what's his name? Replication crisis. A lot of those studies in the soft sciences, social sciences, have not been replicatable. What does that tell you? That the original findings were not really justified. And that's an absence of healthy skepticism that made that possible. So that's a really good example of the need for local skepticism in science.
Oh, certainly. And you've mentioned history and maybe even historians to a certain degree. It's, I'm not sure if the best word to use, disappointing to see or to witness. But when you take a look at the young generation of current historians, or those that are close to becoming historians, sure, they may
Excuse me, I have a cold.
That's okay. Surely they may go through a similar process of, going to archives, doing research, but what are they doing that does not make their work genuinely independent? And that is they, repeatedly quote each other.
Oh.
So when you're looking for a discovery in history, it is very difficult to see because most of the modern day historians are doing with something that is called like repetitive quoting.
Yeah, there's a mathematician named James Lindsay, who, together with a philosopher named Peter Boghossian and a scholar and journalist, a woman who's an editor of Ario magazine, her name is Helen Pluckrose. The 3 of them wrote a bunch of fake articles just made up stuff, quoting things like that, and making up quotes, just like completely fake as a way of testing. It was kind of an expose to test some of these social science journals that they believed were ideologically so biased based on just the repetition of endless ideology that winds up getting published as scholarship. They just thought, this is a way to test this. Let's try and hoax them and do an expose. We'll write all this, what we think is fantastic ideological nonsense, but the kind that we think that they'll like to hear, and submit it. And these are peer-reviewed journals, and they published 7 of them, of these articles, right? And they were ridiculous. And then they exposed it. So what they call, what the thing that you were talking about, stacking layer upon layer of quotation, they say they have a much more sinister way of describing it. They call it concept laundering, like money laundering. So as long as, you know, a phrase, a concept, a theoretical claim, an ideological point gets into one of these journals, then they all start quoting it and referring to it. And then, like, the bibliographies look so well researched at the back of the paper that all these other journals, it's a kind of house of cards. The whole thing is an illusion. And that's the replication crisis in the social sciences. Almost none of it has its feet in the ground in actual evidence, in real studies that were replicated. So yeah, my diagnosis of that problem is an unhealthy absence of doubt, insufficient local skepticism driven by ideological bias or confirmation bias. We're all subject to confirmation bias tendencies by nature. You know, almost none of us want to think that our beliefs are false. And many of us by nature are inclined, confirmation bias studies suggest that we're inclined to notice things that confirm our biases and to dismiss or ignore or downplay things that contradict our biases, you know, our cherished beliefs. So that's what that's all about. Yeah. So I think we've already answered a really big question, which I was going to ask you, but you might still want to say more about it, is what's one of the positive roles of a kind of rational doubt? I mean, there can be irrational doubt. So I mentioned this. Global skepticism is the belief that nothing can be known. I don't think anybody who does science or who likes science believes in global skepticism. And like you said, they wouldn't even perform an experiment if they didn't think the results mattered, right? So global skepticism is completely antithetical to science. But like, there are different kinds of doubt, right? So I just gave, well, we gave one, you know, one whole range of examples, like pseudoscience or poor social science or even poor real science. Sometimes there's real science that turns out to be unreplicable, like those studies in telepathy, ESP and all that. Originally, they got results that seemed statistically significant. And then when they tried to replicate them in other labs, they couldn't be replicated. So obviously what was happening, the images on the person's card that you have to be a mind reader and tell me what card I'm holding. Maybe it was seen on my glasses or something like. So when they put people in different rooms without any way to communicate with each other, they didn't get any telepathic results, you know? So and that's real science. So, you know, it happens in the hard sciences too, but yeah, replication is necessary because skepticism makes sense. Like, doubting new results that nobody expected, or any result, even results that you expect. You shouldn't be certain. You should check. Did we do it wrong? How do we know? Maybe we're biased. Let someone else in another lab do it. Who wants to prove me wrong? So there's that competitive aspect to science that we say, those people at Cambridge, they claim that they found this. Let's do that here and see. Oh no, we didn't get the same result. Why not? Did we do it wrong or did they do it wrong? So like built into science is you have to be vigilant for your own errors and other people's errors. And that's a form of doubt.
Certainly. There's many important words and sentences and concepts there that you mentioned. But definitely, doubt is very much a part of science. If you take a look at any of the previous scientific theories, or that are dubbed with the word theory, all of them were in doubt during the time that they were
Introduced.
launched into society.
Right.
Because again, people were doing that what is natural to science, and that is they were doubting it. Why? Well, because the evidence during that period of time was not necessarily strong enough or convincing enough. So currently in the 21st century, we have gathered more evidence, and you can go anywhere from the theory of evolution to the theory of plate tectonics. You can talk about how much people doubted Alfred Wagner when he came out with the theory of plate tectonics. He was called all sorts of names.
Yeah, they thought he was a crackpot.
100%.
But he was absolutely right.
But he was absolutely correct. So in today's age, if you practice this scientific doubt or this scientific skepticism, you are branded to a certain degree as being anti-science, because you are supposed to basically believe everything and accept everything that is fed or spoon-fed to you. And this is the very big, very dangerous mistake that is being sometimes even advertised by scientists.
Yeah.
I remember Richard Lindzen, who I'm not sure if he currently still is, but was an MIT professor of physics and atmospheric sciences. He said, whenever you hear the word that the science is settled, you know that this person has stepped out of the realm of science. And, he is one of the minority of
Yes, he is.
21st century scientists who have, clinged to the root of what is science. And they're not going to refrain from that, because then it would pose it would pose a credible, threat to their credibility of being a scientist.
Yeah, that's an excellent quote. It kind of calls to mind, for me, when is that claim used, right? So it's kind of like when I teach philosophy of religion, and one of my students will, at some point or another, it's inevitable that it will come up. And I even said it earlier, but I meant it in a different way. Everything happens for a reason, right? So when one of my students will use that, I'll pause and ask the class, what are the conditions under which people normally make that statement? Usually when something horrible happens, when somebody died, or something like evil happens to an innocent good person, right? So it's an appeal somehow or another to a belief in some kind of spiritual, mystical, religious, just world theory, as we call it in philosophy, right? That, well, the world really is just because it's governed by some benevolent force or higher power or whatever it is, that makes sure that even when horrible things happen, there's some kind of good that will come out of it. It's all for a reason. It's like part of a divine plan. And appealing to this concept that everything happens for a reason is soothing, right? So that's something to take into consideration, because the fact that it's psychologically functioning as a security blanket should cause you to doubt whether or not it's true. Just recognizing that it has this narcotic effect on my existential anxiety, maybe even though it might make me feel good, that's equally good reason to think it might be false, right? So I'll play around. It's almost like there's a phrase that lawyers use that comes from Latin, or business people will use it too, cui bono, which means who benefits or to whose good, right? So when you see, well, they got this new legislation, well, who's going to benefit from this? Like, what's behind this legislation, right? So similarly, I'm bringing those two things in as comparisons. Everything happens for a reason. Why do people say that? Or cui bono, what's behind it? Who's to benefit from it? When do people say it's settled science? It's settled science, right? What's behind that? Usually some political agenda or ideology that's being challenged. People have a, so climate change, right? That's a classic example that it's in dispute among scientists, right? But the general public has been led to believe that the entire community of legitimate scientists completely accept a particular interpretation of climate change, which says that it's entirely human caused and it should be remedied in a certain way, right? Like we have to eliminate carbon emissions by this year. And like, so if you question any part of that narrative, right, the answer will be, this is settled science. Well, you might consider it well-established science that there's a human contribution to greenhouse gases, no doubt, and that it has to do with the carbon, burning of carbon and so on and so forth. That's true. How dangerous it is, how much of it's been going on, how much of the rest of climate change is not caused by humans, whether or not it can be regulated and to what extent, how dangerous it is, all of those things are not even well-established science. A lot of those things are political overlays on what is well-established science. But well-established and settled are not the same thing. Am I correct? You're more of a science person than I am, right? Like evolution theory it's well-established. Scientists who believe in it think it's settled, but that's not the appropriate way to look at it. As my friend, my co-host that I mentioned earlier, Mark Gleason, said to me when I was arguing with him about this for the very first time, and he made me doubt myself because I used to believe, oh, well, the whole community of climatologists say it's true, so it must be true. I'm not a scientist. I believe what they say. And he said, well, by analogy with evolution theory, which is settled science, he said, what if they found a rabbit fossil in the Precambrian period? Wouldn't that throw a wrench into the evolution theory? I said, yeah, you're right. He said, so like the scientific method and the scientific attitude is, it's well established, it's tentatively true, but nothing is settled. Just like Newtonian physics was settled until Einstein came along. So is this correct, my way of thinking about it, or no? What do you think?
And this word settled in science is just a word that is simply not compatible with
Okay.
scientific thought.
Thank you.
The only folks that I hear using this word are either, people that have been in the just process and the habit of watching too much TV, or of simply reading a lot of Apple articles about what some writer or narrator has mentioned about a scientific topic. Now, there are many things within climate science that are very difficult to measure. So when you say that this is settled, you are contradicting the very textbook that you are teaching from.
Yeah.
Because things like measuring water sea levels, such completely difficult. Sure, you can use a stick in the water, but the stick in the water in the Adriatic is going to be different than in the Atlantic. So coastline. So you have to see that there is a complexity in the research. So
and so much of that is based on simulation models.
yeah, certainly.
I know from previous conversations with you, you do not have a very high opinion of simulation. Not that they don't have a purpose, but there's something very different from simulations and actual hard evidence.
Oh, certainly. I mean, simulations have a limit, and the limit is that this is not necessarily observable evidence. This is more of, playing a chess game and looking at 30, 80 moves ahead.
Yeah. And involves an
What
awful lot of
model?
prediction, approximation, probability, and a lot of uncertainty.
Correct. I mean, certain things models are definitely useful for. I would say geological work is definitely one of them. If students want to learn how a river is formed, how do you know if a river was present in this landscape? How do you know that a mountain building event was present in this landscape? You can use a simulation to understand that, because if the simulation shows that what you see in the landscape, then you have not just a observable confirmation, but you also have a confirmation from the simulation too. So one complements the other.
Right.
But when it comes to climate science, you're talking about catastrophic events to a certain degree, which are very difficult to foresee. Why? Well, because of the percent of temperature increase being extremely minimal. Now, obviously, it depends which interpretation you want to take. Some are going to say just because the temperature rise is minimal does not mean that it is not dangerous. But who has done the observable research that would define that would conclude that? No one has done that. It is just a view of thinking. It is just a thought, simply put. And nobody is saying that the earth is not warming, the earth is not changing temperatures. All of that is very present. It has been present during the geologic period of the earth. Obviously, we are seeing some form of an increase, but then again, we're talking about measuring very difficult variables in this
And very many of them.
equation.
And very many variables.
And very many, yes, certainly.
It's as complicated as meteorology, predicting the weather. I mean, there are certain events that are even major weather events that are falsely predicted by models. Some are true, some are false. So then what do? Inductive analysis of the simulations, right? Okay, so this program, tends to have like a 78% accuracy in its simulating predictive power, right? So, okay, well, what about the other 22%? So same thing with climate simulations, I mean, weather and climate are almost the same thing. So, I mean, they got Hurricane Sandy right. They get a couple of things right, the meteorologists. But even then, they were saying there's a chance if the tide is high with the Gulf Stream currents, the temperature of the water, the winds, the moon, and if all these things meet in the wrong way at the right time, we're going to have Hurricane Sandy. But that was within a percentage of error, and it just happened to come that was true. But it's easy to say after the fact, okay, they predicted this nor'easter correctly, but that one moved off into the ocean before it got to New York, this kind of thing. So when you look at, in my thinking, climatology and meteorology, I mean, the word is really, I don't know why they even call it meteorologists, because they're not studying meteors, but, they're studying the weather. They really are climatologists, really, the meteorologists. They're not astrophysicists, so they should change the name. You know a little bit about the history of science. Do you know how they ever wound up with that name?
I'm not entirely sure, but I think that may maybe I'm speculating now that may be a more of an entertainment construct.
Right, right. Well, when there are meteor showers, and the weatherman will report that there will, there will be an eclipse tonight, or there will be a meteor shower, or whatever. Okay, so
I mean, I am certain, for example, that any physicist would be able to tell you just as good information about the weather as your local weatherman, because understanding physics is also to a very strong degree understanding weather concepts.
absolutely, yeah. Geology and astrophysics, anybody who's good at either of those could probably be a really good weather person. All right, one last topic that I was curious. Well, two things. One, I want to just kind of make sure I got you right. I think you said, or if I can kind of rephrase what you said in a way that will work for those people that I was having my debate with on Twitter, that from a scientific point of view, doubt is rational, or at least doubt can be used rationally, and it's even essential, and frequently has been essential in the history of scientific growth. And so it's positive. It's much more likely to produce concrete positive knowledge than it is to produce global skepticism. So am I right about that? The scientific attitude is probably much more favorable towards local skepticism and very unfavorable toward global skepticism. Is that a correct characterization of the scientific attitude?
Perhaps if you were to give me an example of what that would
Okay,
look
so
like,
just to remind you,
I
yeah,
could more
so
like elaborate on it.
right, okay, so look, a global skeptic is somebody who thinks knowledge is impossible. And global skeptics will point to the fact that everything in the history of science overturns something else. So they'll use induction and say, well, look, the scientific method is always proving itself to be false, or something like that. And so they, based on that and other arguments that they have, they say any kind of knowledge is impossible. It's all just beliefs that we have some confidence in for whatever reason, but there's no reality, there's no knowledge. That's global skepticism. Local skepticism is doubting this or that particular claim because you have evidence or reason to doubt it. So I'm suggesting that I think I got from the way you described all of the things you said, that science is would have a negative attitude towards global skepticism and a very positive attitude toward local skepticism. That's all I'm asking you.
Yes, and this is what it would naturally do. But then we have to think about some factors here, and that is how sincere are those scientists who would say that they cling to the local skepticism but avoid the global skepticism. And the only reason that I am mentioning this is because when you look at some of their actions or some of their statements, it is clearly evident that they may be in favor of global skepticism. And that depends on the topic that is being discussed, or that is being perpetrated upon society as a whole. Obviously one of them is climate science. That is definitely one. That is not focused on a local skeptical level from the scientific community at all. I think they see scientists or teachers or the average person who look upon climate change as not settled science. They see them as the local skeptics or the local doubters. So it's not necessarily very clear in this sense, because it depends on the topic and who is involved in this case. Do you have a broader scientific community involved? Do you have the over 100 scientists whom I've never seen a list of their names yet, if that list even exists?
Right. So I think what you're saying is science in general is not friendly towards global skepticism. It embraces local skepticism, but any given individual who presents themselves as a scientist, they may or may not actually be a certain kind of scientist, but they might be driven by other ideological values or beliefs that they have, and will profess a certain kind of skepticism just to kind of give cover to their ideology, or they're not being intellectually honest. And well, that can happen in any walk of life, right? So yeah, the way that we might want to just say, how could we finesse that problem is, it's hard, but I think you put your finger on it when you said genuine or authentic or integrity. I forget what word you used.
Yeah,
but intellectually honest.
So yeah, you have to be intellectual honest here, and you have to have some form of integrity.
Right.
Because if you are a scientist by definition of the degree that you have, if you've done research, especially if you've done peer-reviewed research, but you abstain from the global skepticism as being something that is not compatible with science, then you are not being authentic in this case. Because at the root of science is to be skeptical at the local level and to have doubt at the local level. That does not mean that being skeptical at the local level is going to generate a answer, or that it's going to generate new research, but it is the first step to generating further research.
Right. The way that I would say it is, it's not sufficient, but it is often necessary. If you don't,
certainly.
Yeah, if you don't doubt the currently accepted models, then they'll never change. Yeah.
I mean, that's how it begins. And
Right.
You start with a question, and then you move further with the scientific method. Unfortunately, I think that 21st century scientists, whether they are of a young generation or whether they're the older generations, and I don't speak for everybody here, obviously, but there is definitely the trend. There's definitely an observation that can be made about some of their actions. And that is, simply put, that they have done, or they have made the mistake that I would say some people make in the religious community, and they have fused or are attempting to fuse politics with science.
Yeah.
Now, the people in the religious community, what sometimes they tend to do, they fuse politics and religion.
Right.
And when you do that, then you have genocide. That has been the historical account. So when you fuse science and you fuse politics, then you have eugenics.
Yeah.
Then you have mass extermination. So in order for you to be very structured, very strict in your practice, you have to stick to the foundation of your practice.
Which for science is reason and observation. That's the bottom line. I mean, you can break those categories down into kinds of reasoning and kinds of observation and kinds of testing and all of that. But fundamentally, that's the only evidence that we have for anything. I like, what was his name? Christopher Hitchens. I think I might have quoted this to you once in a previous conversation. I believe he said once something like this: if somebody presents a claim to me without also presenting its justification or its evidence, they haven't given me a reason to believe it. And so I don't even need a reason to ignore it. Right? And that's kind of related. That's a principle that's related to scientific thinking, which is that the axiom is that don't accept a claim without evidence for it. Without evidence for it. All right, last question. I said last question, but I didn't get to the last question because we're already a little over an hour and I didn't want to go too far. So a number of the people that I was debating with on Twitter were equating doubt with self-doubt. You are muted right now. I don't know if you realize it, but it's okay. As long as you know, when you want to speak, you unmute yourself. But self-doubt is when you have insecurity about your own abilities and, presumably you have certain skills and good character traits and whatnot. And then instead of acting on them, fear or self-doubt cripples you. So doubt can be negative if like in the case where you don't really have good reason to doubt yourself, but you do doubt yourself, right? So there's no doubt in my mind, ironically, there's no doubt in my mind that self-doubt can be negative, but I don't equate doubt with self-doubt. That's number one. Number two, I can imagine self-doubt can also be good. Depends on what your conceptions of yourself are. So if you have certain images of yourself, right? Like I can imagine a person who's very egotistical, narcissistic, aggressive, bullying, whatever, and they don't realize, they think that these are all great, I'm strong and all this and, and like, but then they start experiencing some reactions from people that, if they're really thick-skinned, they might not even notice it, but they might at some point offend somebody they really care about or something. And then they begin to doubt themselves. I think that's a good thing, like that they might realize my modus operandi, my way of carrying myself in the world isn't ideal. Or I might begin to just entertain, am I going about things the wrong way? I seem to be losing friends left and right. That's a good thing. That's a good thing. And I'm not saying people should never be strong-minded or have, thick skins or anything like that. But I'm saying I can imagine self-doubt can be good and it can be bad, depends on the context and the circumstances. So I would just like to hear what you think about doubt versus self-doubt. Can it be positive or negative or that sort of thing? And then we'll wrap it up.
Yeah, I certainly agree with you with that. You have to decipher doubt from self-doubt. And you have to understand that there are certain variables that are present and at play here. So for example, if you are a 5-year-old or a 6-year-old and you are still in the developmental stages and you're doubting your ability, for example, to swing on the monkey bars, then that type of doubt will disable you from achieving that goal.
Excellent.
However, if you are a 20-year-old or 25-year-old and you are researching a specific topic, or you're trying to maybe figure out what is the purpose of life, which is the grand question of them all, and for some reason you have been brought up to believe that there is this one thing that is the purpose of life, but then you've reached 25 years of age and you're starting to doubt that. And this doubt comes into play because you are, critically thinking. There was something in your life, whether it was an observation, whether it was a book that you read, whether it was somebody that you spoke to, that has enabled you to doubt that which you believed previously to be true. So that's the distinction that I would make there, and pertaining to doubt and self-doubt.
Good. I would agree with you. I like the example. I would imagine that if you were raised to be a fundamental Christian or a fundamentalist Muslim or a fundamentalist anything, right? Like very deeply indoctrinated to believe your religion, so much so that you internalize it, you're very proud of it, you cling to it, it defines you, it's your identity, right? You're like a cult member. And the only difference between a cult and a religion is that religions are successful cults. That's the only difference that I could see, objectively speaking, right? A cult is a kind of smaller, temporary thing that doesn't last that long. You know, it doesn't become established. So if you're a cult member, you're almost incapable of thinking for yourself. You don't have an identity. You completely, by osmosis or whatever, indoctrination, brainwashing, groupthink, whatever, you completely accept the model. You should have doubts about yourself. You're not thinking for yourself. And if you pay attention, you'll realize anytime I try to think anything different from what the group says, I feel guilty. I'm afraid I'm going to be ostracized, whatever. Those are doubts, and you should pay attention to them. You shouldn't ignore them. So I'm somebody who, as a philosopher, I think doubt is one of our natural philosophical instincts, that a model, a belief, a worldview, whatever, might be wrong. That's the inner nature of a human being, which is very much part of the same aspect of the human core that you were saying makes human beings want to understand reality, which is what gives birth to science. It comes out of the same part of the human mind. I want to believe reality. I want to know reality. And this model that's been working for me, it might not be true. So I think if I've identified with all of that, and I think of it as me, I am a Muslim, or I am a Catholic, or whatever it is, I'm a Buddhist, or, you know, and I start to entertain a doubt about it, that's a good thing, because then I might be able to become an authentic human being who believes the things that I believe because I have found good reasons to believe them, other than the fact that my tribe raised me to believe that. So any final words from you about doubt?
Yes, I would conclude with, doubt is probably one of the first step of learning, one of the learning process.
All right. Well, thank you, Edin. It was a great conversation, and I look forward to having more of these with you. We can email each other about possible topics, but it's been a great pleasure.
Same here. I'm very much appreciative to have this opportunity with you, and I have much respect for you. And I hope that we will continue with further discussions, and I'll be more than happy to contribute.
Excellent. Well, we've been doing this for a while without recording them, and this was our first experiment in finding out whether or not recording them and sharing them is actually going to be something that's fruitful. So we'll see after time. We'll get some feedback on when other people hear us chatting. Maybe it's just us thinking we're so brilliant, we bounce off of each other, but we'll see what the critics have to say.
Yes, I certainly agree with you. Definitely.
Okay, Edin. Well, I see the dark room there, so that's okay, because we're signing off now. Did your kid shut off the light or something?
I think so, yes.
Yeah, that's okay. He's trying to say, Daddy, come on, it's supper time. All right. I'll see you next time. Take care, Edin.
Thank you very much. Continue to feel better.
Oh, yes. Thank you.
You're welcome. Bye-bye.
Ciao.